Okay, let's make a formal start. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all. I'm a Greenpeace speaker. I'll just give you a few comments about Greenpeace, although I'm sure most of you have heard of us. We too are a charity. This is actually our 50th anniversary, so we've been going for 50 years now. Basically, we're an organization that has presence pretty much in every country in the world. So over 100 countries we have a presence. And our primary sort of way of trying to make a difference is through campaigning. So we're really a campaigning organization. We also have a relatively strong sort of a research group. So we try and find out things, do a lot of investigations. So for example, in the case of plastics, a lot of research to see how far they've kind of spread, testing rivers, testing remote islands, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work done to generate data to support our campaigning, as well as, of course, putting pressure on organizations, which is really a different part of the campaigning. But ultimately, we're obviously trying to both educate the public and educate the governments in order to bring about change. So the two topics I thought that would be useful are, first of all, global warming, and the second one, plastics. So we'll start with the global warming one first. We internally tend to refer to this as a climate emergency. So we try and sort of use that term quite a lot. The idea being, I suppose, to try and make people aware that this is an emergency now and not something that is going to happen in many years into the future. So the term emergency is very deliberately chosen. And of course, the reason for it is that we have very large changes in climate that have taken place over the last 50, 75 years. And as you'll see in the next slide, the change is accelerating at quite a pace. And of course, this change is occurring all the time and everywhere. So it's not restricted to Western nations where perhaps we've contributed a lot more to the problem. But of course, the reality is it's occurring everywhere. So if you just look at this graph, the red one essentially is the temperature. You can see there was a time when it was sort of wiggling up and down, and then I don't know whether you can see my cursor, and then it basically started to go up relatively uniformly in a straight line. The yellow line is I put deliberately because that's the way in which we try and convince people that there is indeed a change going on, and that this rise in temperature is not simply because there are thermal events going on. So the yellow one actually is the intensity of radiation from the sun. So the sun is primarily where all the energy comes from. And so the argument sometimes is that, well, these changes occur all the time. These are going to reverse themselves. And you can see that there is a clear disconnect. So although the solar intensity actually has been going down for quite a while, the rise in temperature is unabated. So what we're hoping for, obviously, is that red line, instead of continuing to go up, the slope starts to go down, and then eventually it becomes horizontal, and if we're lucky, maybe even comes down somewhat. So that's just part of the evidence for believing that this is a phenomenon that is not just a natural one that occurs all the time. Moving on to sort of further evidence, if you like. So this is looking at the North and the South Pole, and normally what you'd see here of course, is ice everywhere. And this picture, of course, tells you a completely different tale, which is that there's been a lot of melting in the ice caps, and therefore you now have water instead of ice everywhere. And of course, the first thing that suffers is the wildlife in the areas, which then has to migrate and find other places to live. And migration indeed is a common theme, as you'll see as we go through. In other words, the effects of it are quite dramatic in terms of both people and wildlife. Here's a picture that perhaps brings that home a little bit more clearly. So a photograph in 1984 and in 2016, and you can see the area, the white, the ice caps, how they've shrunk in just that relatively short period of time. So very hard to argue with photographs like that. So then, if we talk about what's the real impact of the ice caps melting, of course, the one that everyone is aware of is that once ice melts, you make water, and then it means that the sea levels rise. And of course, that's an effect everywhere. So the shores rise, and of course, some cities, towns are struggling and indeed will disappear over time because of this rise in sea levels. Another change that's occurring is acidification of the water. This is related to the fact that as the level of pollutants in the air increase, so there's the concentration, for example, of carbon dioxide increases in the air, then more of it will tend to dissolve in the water. And as it dissolves, then the water becomes slightly more acidic. So that's the relationship between climate change and the acidification of the ocean. By the way, one other thing I forgot to emphasize. So as the ice caps melt, you also get a slightly domino effect. So in the first place, the warming melts the ice caps, and then as the water is exposed, you then absorb more of the heat, because when it was ice, a lot more of the heat was reflected back. So the melting of the ice caps, in fact, adds to the warming, because we're not reflecting so much of the heat back. Going back to the acidification of the water, this has side effects. For example, in terms of the bleaching of the coral under the sea, and coral is a habitat that is a little bit like the ice caps in terms of, but in terms of sea life, and this is a sort of a living environment that is necessary for a lot of sea life to exist in. And once we get the bleaching of the coral, then of course sea life starts to migrate, because they can no longer sustain life there. So this is a picture that makes that clear. So the one on the left, the colorful one, is how coral should be, and the one on the right is where bleaching has taken place. Now, it's not, the important thing is not that it's not so colorful, but the fact that the coral essentially has died. And once that happens, then sea life and so on can't be sustained, and so you get migration from that, from the water as well. And then just going on, these other impacts, I think you'll be perhaps more familiar with. One of them is health, for many reasons. One, of course, is that economies get affected once you get no rain for long periods of time. Food and lots of other social problems start to occur, and so that's something that we have to be very aware of. And there are indeed several parts of the world where this has become so bad. In other words, rainfall has been so poor for so long that you're starting to get displacement. And of course, the other part of it is that the economy also starts to be affected, because the governments are spending more and more money on catering for the effects of climate change, rather than spending it on things that they would otherwise have done, such as more hospitals, better schools, social care, and so on and so forth. So the effect on the economy starts to get worse because we're spending more and more time on coping with the effects of climate change. So whilst on the one hand you have lack of rain and rising temperatures in many places, you unfortunately get completely the opposite in other places where you've got rain and floods at levels that can't be sustained either. And so once again, you get displacement from these areas too. And you can see there we're talking about at the moment something in the region of 20 million people displacing just internally. In other words, not going from one country to another, but eventually that will start to happen as well. So just come back to global warming, climate change, and so on. Let's look at the cause. The number one cause, in other words, the thing that contributes the most to climate change is energy, our consumption of energy. This contributes roughly 55%. In other words, around 55% of the pollution, the carbon dioxide and related thing that causes this is due to consumption of energy. So in some ways, this is a very sort of convenient way to look at the problem, that it is something that we all understand and something that we all contribute to. So we're talking, of course, about electricity, huge consumption of energy through electric generation, other forms of heat, especially in industry, but of course in homes as well, for cooking and heating in the winter. Then transportation, and then various industries, some a lot more than others, such as cement, for example, fertilizer. Those are industries which consume huge amounts of energy. So if we think about this being our major contributor, then it's clear that unless we make a significant difference to the energy that we consume, the amount, and then the manner in which it's generated, we're never going to turn that red curve that I showed you earlier. So the energy source, of course, that I'm sure you're aware of, that has contributed the most is the fact that we use fossil fuels to heat our homes, to generate the electricity, and so on. And then the fossil fuels themselves contain carbon, and then the carbon is turned to carbon dioxide, and then that in turn means that we trap a lot more of the heat from the sun, and then slowly our climate gets warmer. Fossil fuels are not all the same, so there are three basic categories that I'm sure you become familiar with. There's gas, there's liquids, oil, as we call it, and then coal. And these vary quite a lot in terms of their effects. So coal is by far the worst, because coal is essentially all carbon. So every bit of heat that we get out of coal produces carbon dioxide. Oil is not quite as bad, because oil is a mixture typically of carbon and hydrogen. So when the coal in the oil burns, of course, we get the carbon dioxide, but when the hydrogen burns, then we only get water. And then when we look at natural gas, that's even better than oil. In other words, there's even less carbon per unit of energy in gas. The reason I mention that in particular is that we in this country, of course, we're a huge consumer of coal, and most of our electricity was generated through burning of coal. But in the last 20, 30 years, we've actually halved the amount of electricity that's generated from fossil fuels. And the way we've done that is interesting. First of all, of course, we pretty much shut down all the coal mines. But what we've done is replace the coal by a combination of oil and gas. So just by making that switch, it's made a huge difference. The other thing that we've done, which is not so smart in terms of being defensible, is we've exported a lot of our industry. So we don't produce so much of the things in industry that contribute to that. And those two changes, exporting some of our production and switching from coal to oil and gas, has basically halved the amount of CO2 that we produce in producing electricity. So the challenge, of course, now is where do we go from here? And of course, we're slowly but surely replacing more and more of the fossil fuels that we do still burn with solar and wind in particular. So if energy is consuming about 55% of the allocation for global warming, the other 25% that is a major contributor is food. So this is agriculture and the way in which we use land and the food that we eat and so on and so on. So between energy and food and the sort of wider implications of food, we account for around 80% of global emissions. So just these two very simple, tangible, easily recognizable parameters contribute for 80% of the global warming problem. So that's why it's worth focusing a little bit more on what we mean by food and agriculture and how that actually directly contributes. The key thing to think about here is our huge consumption of meat, especially in the West. And in particular, consumption of beef and lamb. These two animals, unfortunately, have a digestive system which directly produces greenhouse gases. They don't produce carbon dioxide, they produce a gas called methane. And although, of course, the amount of methane in terms of the sort of the molecules in the air is way less than carbon dioxide, unfortunately, methane is much more effective in trapping the heat. So a molecule of methane, for example, is about 80 times more effective than a molecule of carbon dioxide in terms of trapping heat. So the contribution that these animals make to methane is quite significant. So that's one of the reasons that meat contributes such a large amount. The other one that we can sort of readily identify is the way in which, especially in the West here, we feed these animals. We don't have really grazing land to mention, and in any case, the amount of meat that we consume, we would pretty much need to allocate all our land to grazing if we were to take that approach. So the other part of the problem is how we actually feed the animals. And the way in which we do this is by importing soybean. So this is a large contributor to how we feed the animals in order that we can consume meat. And the way in which the vast majority of soybean is grown is by cutting down forests, especially in the Amazon in Brazil, to make space for the growth of soybean. And then once that's grown, then it's obviously shipped back to Europe and in particular to this. And this obviously also helps the fact that we have this sort of industrial meat, if you like, the meat farms here, and by being able to feed those animals in this sort of environment, the soybean becomes quite handy. So then the connection is therefore twofold. First of all, the animals themselves producing directly methane, And then secondly, deforestation. So the food to feed the animals on the whole is done by deforestation, making land available and then growing soybean to feed them. So when we then start talking about deforestation, how does that impact the climate? So the first and most direct impact is that the forests and obviously all green plants, their vegetation, consume carbon dioxide. So the process of photosynthesis, whereby all green plant take in carbon dioxide in order to survive, in order to grow. So if we start to cut down forests, then of course we're getting rid of a vital sink which removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's the direct connection between how we choose to feed animals and the climate. And so even though, of course, growing of trees and so on is a popular theme, and many people contribute to that and make donations, of course, it takes a long time for a plant to grow and reach the level that large trees in Amazon forest and other forests will contribute towards CO2 removal. So it's not something that we can easily replace. So just going on to that in a little bit more detail, how can we sort of directly make some sort of an impact? This is a sort of a list of things that we can perhaps think about. The ones on the left have a relatively low impact, and the ones to the right have a higher impact. So, for example, the first one on the left is simply replacing light bulbs, so low energy light bulbs and so on. And then the other ones in the moderate impact. So for example, it includes, not drying your clothes by a tumble dryer, but by hanging them out to dry. Recycling more, basically recycling so that we consume more, and therefore if we're consuming less, then there's less energy required. So this is just a general comment that recycling in general, reusing things and so on, is a good thing for climate change. And then, of course, washing clothes in colder water, and so on. So those are sort of the medium impact things that most of us can do. Then the high impact ones, of course, are harder to do. For example, the extreme right one is in some ways quite contentious because it says have one fewer child. So obviously, if population is less, so, and indeed one of the major causes of the problem is the ever-growing population and our need, therefore, to consume in a very general sense. Live car-free, electric cars, and so on and so forth. So the things that we can do more easily have, of course, a lower impact, and the things that have the most impact, of course, are more difficult to undertake. Then, of course, the other one is diet, and as I've mentioned, meat is a major issue, and therefore change of diet is something that we need to slowly undertake. Doesn't mean become vegetarian overnight, but certainly to try and cut down and then slowly go down that path. This is a graph that sort of illustrates how different forms of meat and related things impact the climate change problem. So the worst, as I mentioned earlier, are beef and lamb. So that's really clearly where we would need to focus. And then if you had to switch, then obviously switching to something like chicken would be the easiest. But remember, even things like eggs and cow's milk and so on, they all contribute for various reasons, but much less than eating beef and lamb. And then, of course, a major issue is how we travel, traveling to work, traveling to school. This, as it says, accounts just schools journeys alone accounts for 1 in 4 cars. So if we could overcome that, then that alone would make a huge difference. So it's habits and finding alternates and making changes to overcome some of these things. Bicycles obviously are obvious. Public transport is another one, and where possible, of course, walking. Flying is a huge contributor simply because it's a mode of transportation that, by definition, every mile contributes a lot more than other modes of transport. So this is being targeted quite a lot as well. Making changes to our habits in the home, of course, is another one. You might be thinking, well, how do you do that? Well, the reason for choosing those pictures on the right is simply to say, wear an extra jumper and reduce the thermostat by a degree. So that's really the sort of comment being made in this picture, is that maybe that's a short-term thing that could have an impact, and 1 degree would actually make a huge difference over a period of time. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, planting more trees, although not as a sort of a justification for thinking that, well, if we're contributing to or planting more trees, then that takes care of the meat consumption problem, which clearly it doesn't. Okay, I want to switch over to plastics, which is the other main initiative that Greenpeace is involved with. Plastics basically have been around for just over 100 years in the way that we understand them to be. The very first known sort of commercial use of plastics was in America to replace pool balls. Pool balls until then were made from ivory, and as you can imagine, they were hard to get, expensive, and so on. So that's where plastic was first put to use, and it's gone from there. It's grown especially fast in the last 20 to 30 years. Up until then, use of plastic grew gradually, but since the 1990s, it's actually been a lot faster, and the range of things for which we use plastics has grown quite a lot. By far, the biggest use of plastics is, again, food related. So this is wrapping, containers, bottles, and so on and so forth. The second, actually, most wide use of plastics is in the building and construction industries. So those are the two main ones, but by far the pollution related application is food related. The key thing about plastics to kind of bring home is single use versus reusable. So if we could reuse everything 2 times, 3 times, 5 times, so if we reuse something 5 times, then we'd only need 1/5 of that particular item. And this is, unfortunately, not always that easy to do. So in fact, all the things you see in this picture normally would be single use. Even the water bottles, although they can be used, there's no actual mechanism and practical way in which they are being reused. Milk carton containers, again, the same thing. Nothing actually happens to them once we're finished with the milk, but there's no plans afoot and methodology for reusing them. So the key problem is single-use plastics by far. And when we can tell by doing surveys to areas like this. So here you see plastic sort of on the sides, but the reality is that pretty much all plastic, something like 80% of the plastic, ends up in waterways one way or another. And the other thing is plastic pretty much can be found everywhere. So on tops of mountains, rivers, literally everywhere in the UK, even the remotest of islands in Scotland, for example, you will find plastic. And this is not because those are the places where people have thrown plastics, but this is the nature of plastics, is that first and foremost, of course, they hang around essentially forever as far as we're concerned. So they don't decay. So that's why you don't find leaves and twigs and so on in the bottom of the oceans and so on, is because they decay. Plastics don't decay. So eventually they will get blown from wherever they were thrown to somewhere close to rivers, into rivers. The rivers then will, of course, transport them onto seas, oceans, and so on. So eventually most plastics end up in riverways. And most of it, as I said, when we do surveys, turns out to be single-use plastics. So if we look at surveys in oceans, for example, one of the biggest and most renowned collection of plastics is something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is an area about 3 times the area of France. And if you think how much bigger France is, let's say, than the UK in terms of the area covered, then that'll give you an idea of the huge quantities of plastic that are making their way into the oceans. And right now, we estimate we throw away about 8 million tons of plastic every year. So huge amounts continue to be added, and most of that basically starts on land. So it's not that people are going to the beaches and throwing it there or finding other ways of throwing it. Most of it is blown away from land. So if we think about how we actually dispose of plastics, basically there are only 2 ways at the moment, and this is either landfills or incineration. And that's because recycling is such a tiny amount that it doesn't really contribute anything. So even the plastics that we put into recycling bags and so on and so forth, a very small amount of them genuinely get recycled. The rest will either be incinerated or end up in landfills. The stuff that ends up in landfills, of course, is simply dig a hole in the ground and throw the problem into that hole. It's nothing more than that. And from landfills, a lot of the plastic gets blown away and is a huge contributor to the problem I mentioned earlier, which is to do with the plastic that ends in the sea. Also, areas, people living close to these dumps suffer a lot from poor health. you end up with chemicals seeping into the ground. People breathe them, especially microplastics. So that in itself is a problem. So one of the other things that the UK government, for example, used to do was to export a lot of our plastic because we claimed that the countries where we were exporting to were recycling it. So examples being Malaysia, Turkey. So we were actually paying them to take our plastic waste and to recycle it. Of course, the reality was they weren't recycling it any more than we're recycling it. And so there's been a huge campaign to try and stop that practice and for us to essentially find our own solutions to our own plastic. Incineration, of course, in some ways gets rid of the plastic, so that does help. The only problem is plastic is, of course, made of fossil fuels. There's a lot of carbon. Essentially, most of the material in oil and gas is turned into molecules which are suitable for making plastic. So the carbon ends up being burnt when we incinerate the plastics. The difference between burning plastics and things like oil and gas is that the plastics are much more toxic because the plastic contains not only the elements from the oil and gas, but also a lot of additives, a lot of metals, a lot of catalysts and so on. And when those are burnt, they produce highly toxic gases compared to simply the burning of oil and gas. The plastics that end up in the oceans, of course, start to affect millions of animals, sea life, seabirds, mammals, turtles, and so on. Several ways in which they're affected. Some of them simply get caught. Others choke. Others think that it's food, and therefore basically their stomachs become full of plastic, and obviously they eventually just starve to death. Microplastics is a sort of a side issue. This is something that has grown over the years. This is deliberately produced plastics, for example, that goes into cosmetics and various other applications. And once that gets into the waters, of course, it's pretty much impossible to remove. So those are the key problems in terms of sea life. I want to just go over how Greenpeace campaigns and now take the plastics as an example. One of the main areas is campaigning major corporations. I'll go over some of them in a moment, but basically the idea is to put pressure on corporations involved in either the manufacturing, the distribution, and so on of plastic waste in order that they can start to make the changes themselves. We also do a lot of research. So as it says there, something like 27 sites in Scotland are used as research centers, basically for collecting data, plus 13 rivers throughout the UK. We also have a research lab down in Exeter where a lot of samples are sent for analysis. And in addition to campaigning corporations, we of course do political lobbying. And the political lobbying is based around data that we develop, these research that we do, and then we use that to try and influence both the governments and the corporations. So that's the primary use of our research facilities. We also will take on new problems or problems that arise and we become aware of, and therefore we'll do investigations to look at causes of things again, so that we can use them to use the information from the investigation to make change. We also work with overseas organizations in different countries. So for example, when I talk about the UK exporting plastics, or essentially exporting our problem away, we actually work directly with several of those countries, Turkey and Malaysia in particular, to understand what they do with the plastic, and then having done that, to bring that knowledge back, and then to try and make changes here. And then we also try and build partnerships with specialist organizations, and I'll talk one of them a little bit later. So some of the lobbying that we've done, for example, microbeads are now banned in the UK. This actually was after a lot of campaigning to bring about this change. In 2021, the government finally banned single-use cotton buds, stirrers, and so on. And then there are plans to take this further and introduce changes on more throwaway plastics. So, for example, the carry bags in supermarkets and so on. So to actually take that a step further. The other thing that we're trying to bring about is deposit return schemes. This is primarily for bottles, bottles of Coke, bottles of this, that, and the other. So we can take them back, get 10p, 20p, or whatever. In other words, that those things actually go back and get used. Scotland is ahead of us in that respect, and they already have introduced the deposit return scheme ahead of us. Just to talk a little bit more about Coca-Cola. So the reason that we targeted Coca-Cola as an organization is that it is the largest producer of plastic bottles, in the region of 110 million bottles each year. By the way, other plastic polluters are also very similar to Coke in terms of what they do. So Nestle, the huge Swiss firm, is the second largest, and Pepsi is the third largest. So the problem is, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is all to do with food and its wrapping and so on. And in particular, if we go to the top of the pile, we're talking about plastic bottles, plastic containers, plastic food that we buy. As far as Coke is concerned, they have taken on board the challenge of introducing deposit return schemes. So changes occurring there. We're putting pressure on the UK government to introduce that, like Scotland has done. The other thing I wanted to mention on pressure is we put a lot of pressure on supermarkets, basically campaigning to bring about change. As you can imagine, the supermarkets don't themselves produce the problems in terms of plastics, but they buy from producers and therefore are the middleman in terms of the producer and we, the consumer. So what we're saying is that if we put pressure on the supermarkets, then they themselves will put pressure on their suppliers to make changes. And so one of the things we did back in 2018, and you see on the right-hand side, is we started to produce tables of the habits of supermarkets. So for example, reducing single-use plastics, that's the first column, and then other measures that we thought would be useful. And the whole idea really is to produce a table so that the supermarkets will feel compelled not to be at the bottom of these things. And that indeed is what happens. So we make consumers aware of it by campaigning outside supermarkets. Then we produce statistics like this, and this combination then starts to make changes. And so what you see here, for example, is simply drawing attention. That's really all that's happening. And supermarkets respond to this because they think that our customers will be affected. And therefore, if their customers, they think their customers will be affected, then they start to make changes. And so supermarkets indeed are contributing. Even their CEO has made himself available and in conversation with us, and directly provides ideas about how they are making changes. Deposit return schemes, again, being a case in point. So this, for example, is the supermarket survey last year. And of course, the ones which were at the bottom are now at the top, and so on and so forth. The order isn't actually all that important. The idea is that it helps to put pressure on them, and therefore they are making changes by putting pressure on their suppliers. I want to mention this organization called Everyday Plastic. Everyday Plastic is basically a sort of a social enterprise, a charity started by a gentleman called Daniel Webb in 2018. This picture that you see here was how he started. He basically started collecting all the plastic he would have thrown away, and instead of throwing it away, he basically kept it. And this is a sort of a photograph, a flat face photograph of all the plastic that he would have thrown away in a year. And his idea was that he wanted to encourage people to become more aware of the sheer volume of plastic that we are throwing away. And we've teamed up with him to actually take this a step further, because what we realize is that actually there are no statistics for directly quantifying how much plastic each household produce, how much household waste is of particular categories. In other words, how much of it is it just wrapping, how much of it is bottles, how much of it is cans, and so on and so forth. So we decided that with the help of Everyday Plastic, we will team up and do this survey. So this is called the Big Plastic Count. So this is the only thing that you need to remember is the words, the Big Plastic Count. And if you type it into Google, you will get, you'll get a few stray things as well, but you will get the item that I want you to notice, which is that Greenpeace is doing a survey, and for you to register your name and get involved. The survey itself, in other words, the count itself, will be done between 16th and 22nd of May. So we've got a fair bit of time. But what we would like from now until then is for households to register. And once they register, then we will send them information. We will even send them bags in order that they can collect and so on, and show them how they can then send us the information so that we can collect the data. So how to take part? Well, the first step is to tell everyone in your households that you're doing the survey, and of course the week in which you're doing it, so that you don't get a situation where some people are still throwing the waste away, the plastic waste away, and therefore you're not getting a true measure of how much plastic your house is producing. And then once that's underway, then you start counting. And then at the appropriate time, you upload the information. We'll provide you with the necessary information on how to do that. And then after we've got the data and so on, we'll communicate back with you to tell you how much the plastic footprint of your household and how that compares with others, but also other details, as I said, such as what are the types of waste that we're producing. So if we talk about just bottles, what are the variety of bottles, and whether or not we can say, okay, 80% of the bottles are of this type. Maybe the Coke and Pepsi only and whatever, so that we can then start to target deposit return schemes so that they really work. And also then we can feed that information back to both suppliers, to supermarkets, and to government. So to register for that, you can either go to that website address, or basically just type in Google thebigplasticcount.com/sign up. Thebigplasticcount.com will work as well. Then you just have to click somewhere and then you get to the sign up. But that's really all you need to do initially, is just to, the sign up just means your name, address, email address, and that's it. And then we will start communicating back with you to give you the necessary information and details. So that's really all that's necessary in order to make that happen. As I said, the idea is that we will use that information to share that with the government, to share that with the public, to share it with supermarkets and so on, so that we can target the actions, both of government and of us as individuals, based on facts, and therefore make our efforts much more effective than they are at the moment, because we just don't have any information about plastics that we can use to do that. So just coming to the end, basically the three things sort of I'd like you to take on board are fairly obvious. First one, the most effective thing we can do, of course, is reduce plastic. So when we buy things and so on, try and buy things that don't have plastic wrappings and so on wherever you can. I know it's difficult. I've obviously experienced that myself. And where possible, say no to single-use plastics. Use glass bottles, metal bottles, containers. When you go to Starbucks or whatever, take your own containers if possible, and so on and so forth. So it's things like that. And then the third one is, of course, educate others. That's really what spread the word is. Educate others in your home, your family, your friends, etc., so that what you've picked up can be shared and can have a much bigger impact. And that's it. So I'm glad to say I've finished with 10 minutes to go, so that there's time for questions and we still can finish on target. So I'd be happy to chat and answer any questions that you have. Of course, change from.
Hi. Can you hear me? Because I'm having trouble with my internet at the moment.
Yeah, Jen, I can hear you.
Hi. Can I ask a question? Two questions, actually. First of all, does Greenpeace have a local group that our members could join? And I'm sure they do, but if you could email the office with those details, that would be useful. We can publicise it. But the other question I have for you is about plastics. And are there alternatives to plastic other than tin cans, which drink manufacturers can use? Or is it that you're campaigning for single-use plastic, for multiple-use plastic, i.e. recycling?
Yes, so the issue here is, can we economically go from plastics to totally non-plastics? And we believe that the answer to that in the short term is no. So that's likely to be too big a step on a grand scale. So that's why we're saying that the short-term step, which we believe can happen, is that we start switching more and more to reusable plastics, and not simply say that we've got to find alternatives to plastics, because finding alternatives to plastics, first of all, will be quite difficult, and secondly, probably uneconomic for a lot of organizations. So that's the reason for taking that step. Of course, if we're going to make changes internally in our house, let's say when we go and buy a coffee at whatever place you go to, you take your container. Those can be metal. They can even have a vacuum jacket to make sure your coffee stays hot and so on. So things like that we can do, but that's not something that we think will easily happen on a large enough scale in the time scales that we think we would like to make the change. So that's the reason for it.
So when you put pressure on, say, Coca-Cola, you're asking them to have a system whereby people can return their bottles and they can reuse them, or?
Yes. So the role of Coca-Cola or any manufacturer is to agree that if bottles are returned, they will provide 10p, 20p, or whatever. So that's step number one. They have to agree to do that. And then secondly, the sort of shops, supermarkets which sell their Coke then have to be incentivized to take back those bottles. So it's no good them saying, yeah, we'll give you 20p for every Coke bottle, but they've given no incentive to supermarkets, etc., to actually do the collecting. So those are the two things that we're asking them to agree to do. And indeed for other manufacturers to do, and for shops and supermarkets and so on to be willing to undertake if the supplier takes that step.